let's start with your own personal experience. So, Kayleigh, could you tell us a little bit about your mum and, you know, when she got diagnosed with bipolar? And would you mind sharing what you're comfortable to share around that, please?
Yeah, my mum's first full mental breakdown that saw her sectioned in my lifetime was when I was 11 years old. Prior to that, I knew my mum struggled with depression, but not because anybody spoke to me about it, but I could see that her behavior might be a bit erratic in the way when you're 11 that you can sort of process something. She would not get out of bed in the morning sometimes, or wouldn't get out of bed for a couple of days, and then but also she worked very hard. She had like 2 jobs to keep us afloat, so she was always exhausted as well. So it wasn't entirely bizarre to me that she might be in bed, but I sort of knew that my friends' mums wouldn't be in bed for 2 days, if you know what I mean. And then other times she might be like, really manic. I'd get up and she'd been up since 5 a.m. cleaning the house, sort of thing. So she was sectioned when I was 11, and at the time it was known as manic depression. It wasn't bipolar at that stage. No one ever sat me down and explained what had happened to her or what the illness was. I would just pick up dribs and drabs of what the grown-ups were saying. And I realized then that she'd actually been sectioned when I was first born, when I was a baby, and I hadn't known. And I think prior to me being born, she'd had a stillbirth. My elder sister, I suppose, was stillborn. And I think that might have been the first case of her being sectioned. So that's where it began.
Okay, thank you. And it's this part really interests me about how we're having conversations in our families about mental health and certainly serious mental health conditions. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to come back actually to Kayleigh in a minute, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to come to Mya. Mya, can I come to you with the same question? Could you tell us a bit about your mum and when she was diagnosed, and what was your awareness around that?
Yeah, so my mum describes having her first manic episode when she was 19, when she first went off to uni. And she actually dropped out of uni and eloped with her boyfriend at the time and ended up having my sister a couple years later. And so she's always, I don't know, despite everything, she's always been such a loving, amazing mum. But she really struggled for a long time before becoming a very high-powered lawyer. And I think looking back, sort of the more manic episodes of her bipolar really pushed her through that, despite the sort of depression that she was dealing with as well. But sort of by the time I came around, sort of 10 plus years later, she was sort of very high powered and almost, I didn't actually see her a lot when I was younger because she would work very, very late all the time. I have a lot of memories of her coming home sort of 11 o'clock at night and sort of just coming in quickly to say goodnight. But it was when I was about 8 years old that she became the most unwell she'd been in a couple of decades, and she ended up being sectioned. And similarly, I didn't really understand what was going on, but I understood that she was unwell. I could just tell in a way that a child can tell that she was really struggling. And I used to write her letters a lot while she was in hospital, and she was in there for I think about 2 months in the end. And she knew by that point that she had bipolar disorder. She had figured that out, but it actually took her an extra 2 years after that to actually get diagnosed through the NHS, and actually become medicated. And from there, it was a very long journey throughout my teenage years with her essentially trying to manage that and trying to become more stable. And so it almost went from when I was younger, this woman who I'd always seen as incredibly high powered and incredibly competent, but with sort of dealing with these depressive lows between it, where she would just be in bed for days, sort of learning slowly how to live with that essentially. But yeah.
And thank you very much for that, Maya. And I'm going to come back to you now, Kayleigh. I'm going to come back to you, Maya, and ask you a couple more things about that, actually. Kayleigh, you were saying no one ever sat me down and just kind of explained this. Like, you're kind of reading between the lines, working out that, my mum works hard and sometimes we'll spend a couple of days in bed, and other people's parents don't really do that. And I'm wondering, were you ever sat down? Did anyone ever sit down and really talk to you about it at any point in your life? Or has it always just been this kind of thing that has just been running in the background, but no one really talks about in big detail? Or
No one's ever explained it to me. But to be honest, I don't know if my mum fully understands her condition either. Through writing my TV show, I learned a lot more about it because I was speaking to a bipolar specialist. But anything I know of bipolar is because of my own steam. I went and learned more about it. But I think societally it's taboo, and certainly within my family, and probably a lot of families, it's taboo. It's almost just like viewed as this black mark she was born with. And that's it. And I actually no longer believe that it was something she was born with. I think it was brought on for her by some huge traumas that remained unresolved in her adolescence. But yeah, none of my family would have that understanding of it.
Okay. And it's a lot, right? So I'm the one that's living with bipolar, right? So I'm trying to step out of my lens and try as much as I can step into your lens, right? And try and imagine what that might be like. And I would love to know what that was like for you, because obviously you've got this awareness, right? You didn't need anyone to tell you what was going on, but you knew something was off. You knew that the way your mum was showing up wasn't how maybe typically other parents showed up. How did that make you feel as a young person, especially when you're in those, when you're in those young years and like you can't help but compare yourself to other people and other people's families, and my family looks like this and your family looks like that. And how was that for you?
Well, I definitely felt a lot of shame about what was going on in my home and my family, which is, again, what my TV show kind of deals with, the duality of feeling ashamed of the people that you love most, and then also feeling guilty for being ashamed of someone that you love, etc. On and on it goes. But definitely the most traumatizing aspects of growing up with a mum with bipolar for me was the lies and the secrets and the lack of communication.
Yeah.
And because then as a child, you're not being given the full truth, and that becomes very frightening then, because you can fill in the blanks of, well, why am I not being told the truth? And your imagination can run away with it with you. And I heard this thing, some therapist who I follow on Instagram shared something the other day about how she helps. She's a sort of child psychologist, I think, and she said so many parents contact her saying, I'm worried I'm traumatizing my child over XYZ situation. And she's like, we're sort of misconstruing what a traumatizing event is. Bad events are going to happen in everybody's life at certain points. The moment when they become trauma is when they're not helped, when children are not helped to understand and process what's happened to them. That's when it turns into trauma. And I think that was so key in my childhood, that a lot of these things, if there was someone with more knowledge and understanding who was pulling me aside and making me feel safe and explaining what had happened and understanding that what I was witnessing was frightening,
Yeah.
I think I could have stored it a lot more effectively. But that was the other thing. I would see these sort of like horrendously frightening thing. Like one that comes to mind is when I was 11, my mum had a breakdown and I looked through my bedroom window and she was walking down the middle of the road, clapping her hands, kicking her legs. There was cars beeping going past her. It was terrifying. And nobody ever said to me, wow, that must have been frightening, or how do you feel? How was that to witness? They were just like, shut up, get in your room.
Yeah.
And that was it. So I never felt seen or understood, if you know what I mean. Which thankfully now through writing a TV show that has changed. But yeah, I think it would have changed my life so much if anyone was doing that for me.
I think everything you've said, I completely agree with. And when someone's experience, because here's the thing, your mum was having an experience, albeit a terrible one, and from what you've shared today, multiple difficult experiences in her life, and you are also having an experience of your own through your own lens. And when that is not validated and not held, I think you're completely right. That is where damage occurs, because it's like our reality, which is true, like this is happening to me. So for you, this is happening to you, is denied almost. And there's nothing more frightening and unsafe about thinking you see something and then almost everyone around saying that's not happening, or don't, playing it down. And I think that is incredibly scary.
Yeah, and actually, if we rewind the tape further, when my mum was a child and suffered abuse and was handled in the same way I was handled, brush it under the carpet, pretend it didn't happen. No one acknowledged what she was going through or how frightened or hurt she would have been. And I think that manifested into her illness. So yeah, you see the ripple effect in it, and history repeats itself.
Yeah. My mum doesn't have a mental health illness, but interestingly, kind of on the flip side, we've had a similar conversation where we've both had abuse in our younger lives, and it was handled very differently. For hers, it was very validated and safe, and mine was denied, and I was, called a liar. And the fallout of that is the recovery has been not easier for my mum, but she's never felt misunderstood. She's never felt alone with those experiences as such. And my experience was different, and we were talking about this just very recently. So it's just, you're right, how it's handled and how it's communicated and who's around us and who's going to just steady that ship as we're dealing with difficult things. Because here's the thing, we can't prevent bad things happening to people. We're not that powerful, right? We're not powerful enough to stop all these bad things happening in the world. Sadly, we can do our bit and have our impact, but how we navigate those waters is the key thing that I'm picking up in what you're sharing. Thank you for sharing that with me today. Go on.
I was just going to say, well, you're welcome, and I'm sorry to hear that you've had a similar experience.
Yeah, thank you. It's just interesting to talk about, right? Because, I do think that if we do talk about them in safe ways, it can be incredibly healing, and it can be incredibly empowering for people involved, people around us, and the ripple effect of that goes on and on, right? So I think these important conversations need to happen. And I'm going to come to you, Mya. Same question to you, really. Did someone sit down? Did they talk to you? How was that for you?
It was slightly weird for me as a child, I think, especially because my sister was so much older than me. I was very close with my parents growing up, and their sort of style of parenting pre lots of these things happening to do with my mum was always one of respect and sort of mutual communication, which then when my mum became very unwell sort of went into very different directions, because my dad was able to acknowledge that I was a child, and so he tried to communicate as best he could what was going on without telling me too much information. And he found out a long time afterwards that my mum would actually have very long conversations to me, talking to me about all sorts of things that she probably shouldn't have been at the time. But I think one of the things that I am incredibly appreciative of is the day that she first found out that she probably had bipolar disorder. She came home and she sat down, and she didn't say, I have bipolar, because she didn't think that that would mean anything to me. But she said, I've been I'm probably have something that is essentially mood swings. And she tried to explain that to me. And sort of through my own experiences with her behavior and what she'd been dealing with, to an extent, I understood in a way that a child can. Um, but then, sort of in the subsequent years, lots of things happened that, again, I wasn't really supposed to find out about. There was a period, for example, where my mum ran away and my dad had to call the police, and she was missing for about 12 hours. And he had no intention of telling me about that. And she did, because she thought it was funny. And she didn't understand why I might not think that it was funny. And so, in some ways, having that very close relationship was very positive. And in other ways, I almost knew far, far too much about what was going on, which I think was unhelpful in some ways, in that I became very engaged with sort of the day to day nuances of her mental illness. And sort of, as I got a bit older and entered into my teens, I sort of, even though my parents had no expectation of this, ended up taking on the mental burden of sort of trying to manage, to an extent, both of my parents' mental health, because my dad was struggling a lot with carers fatigue as well. And neither of my parents even particularly knew that I was doing that mentally, and yet I felt like I was constantly trying to manage them. And it wasn't till I was much older that I realized, obviously, it had nothing to do with me or what I was up to or how I acted. It was simply the way that things went. Um, but I think the one thing is that my parents were able to identify, because I come from a family that's very into bird watching and nature, and is very obsessive about the outdoors. And so it was even during because the period after my mum was sectioned, I really completely lost that relationship with her, and we weren't close, and I didn't really talk to her. She'd been very depressed for nearly a year at that point. And it was through the nature and the bird watching, and I think the combination of having a group activity that we felt very comfortable doing together, but also doing something that is as inherently healing as spending time outdoors as a family. I think the fact that we were able to combine that and spend time together is one of the reasons that I still have a really positive relationship with my mum, and we are still incredibly close. Because I think otherwise, that period when I was sort of 8 through to 13, we probably wouldn't have been able to heal from that, unfortunately. Even though I look back and I think one of the things I am grateful for is, even during the really difficult times, she never let me doubt how much she loved me and how much she cared about me, even when, I don't know, she was also talking about essentially how much she wanted to die and things like that. And so, she was always, strangely, always a really wonderful mum, even during really difficult, dark times.
I'm really glad that you managed to, as a family, find that space that was nothing to do with talking about what was going on, but a place to be. It sounds like you found a place to be, right? And just be. And there's something very healing in that, for anybody in any walk of life, really. Can I ask, did your mum ever share with you directly thoughts of wanting to die to you, like real time? Was that something that happened? Because I've just noticed you mentioned that just now. Like, was that in your awareness at that young age, in that language?
I definitely, the reason she was sectioned when I was 8 was because she was incredibly suicidal, and actually
Okay.
she didn't tell me this at the time. She wasn't capable of communicating that, but she had plotted to send us all away for the weekend. She planned it after my sister's exams, so her GCSEs wouldn't be interrupted, all that sort of thing. And my dad, because he was, aware, caught on immediately. But it was, and so it wasn't during that really difficult period, but it was sort of afterwards. I was very very aware of that to differing levels, and there were lots of things I overheard. And I think it probably wasn't until she had maybe healed from lots of things that were still quite recent, that had only happened a year or two before, that maybe she felt comfortable enough to maybe talk to me or joke with me about it, but obviously from my perspective it still like really wasn't funny.
No. No.
Sorry, I do also want to comment, like that was all a few years ago, and she like now that she's better, she actually really deeply regrets a lot of that as well, and having
Yeah.
talked to young me about that.
Yeah. And I think I would like to ask both of you, really. I'll come back to you, Kayleigh, now, if that's okay. On reflection, because what I can hear is, Kayleigh, you've got a lot of where you've just had to figure this out, right? You've just had to be figuring this out as you go along with quite with very little sort of support and guidance from people older than you to kind of keep you feeling emotionally safe, physically safe, all of these things. And Mya, I'm hearing that there was almost sort of the opposite in a way, like a huge oversharing perhaps in some aspects along the way, that as everyone's kind of gone along the journey, people have now realised, oh, maybe that needed to be a bit more age appropriate, or that maybe needs to be a bit more boundaried, or you know, either way, I imagine both of you have come away feeling quite responsible for these adults in your life, and that it's on you to bring safety to these unsafe situations. Like you were saying, Mya, it was never communicated to me that this was expected of me, but I took it upon myself. And then Kayleigh, you didn't have the communication, so I imagine you probably did take a lot of that on yourself, because how could you not? It's a lot for a little person to carry, right? Kayleigh, what I mean, hindsight's just a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could? With that, though, what do you think younger Kayleigh would have really benefited from these older people in her life? What would have been, what would have been age appropriate for you? What would have been boundaried for you? And what might have served you better than the experience you have had?
Well, there's a tricky thing, and I'm assuming Mya might have sounds like maybe have similar experiences, in that when it comes to the parent who themselves has bipolar, so both of our mums, when that person is manic or in a state of breakdown, struggling, you can't really hold them accountable for what they do or say. And for my mum, when she's in those states, she's not aware of what she's doing or saying. So I can't sort of say, I wish she'd never done this X, Y, Z. She's completely out of control. So it's almost pointless wishing. And I think that becomes one of the tricky things for a child, in that to a degree, it's almost a sort of developmental stage that you should be allowed to be angry, rail at your parents, rebel, blame them for everything. And then you become older and wiser and more mature, and you realize, oh God, we're all just human, etc. That's sort of like the way the growing up process is supposed to go. But when you're a child in that situation, you very quickly realize, no, I'm not allowed to be angry. No, I'm not going to get an apology. No, I can't blame her. So it's this like forced maturity way before you're ready. And having to swallow down constantly, like frustration and sometimes just a grief. You just swallow down this grief that I don't get to be a normal kid with a normal parent who gets to do normal things. Just press it down, press it down, press it down until you become an adult, and then realize, God, I've got this ball of resentment growing inside of me. So yeah, that's a tricky element of it. But as you say, hindsight's 2020. So looking back, I was never going to get anything from my dad, who was, I think he had his own mental health issues, but also just abusive, alcoholic, drug addict, whatever. So there's no point me wishing he would have handled it differently. That certainly was never going to come. I wish there was someone else in my family who the hospital could have pulled aside. Probably my grandmother. My mum's mum was the closest person. And I think to hospital staff, it would have been clear that she was the responsible grown-up, because also my dad was frequently banned from being allowed to come into the hospital to see my mum, so they knew he was abusive. So I wish they'd pulled my grandmother aside and said, here's some tools. Do you understand? This is what your daughter's going through, and this is what your grandchildren might need. Because my grandmother would have taken the time, but she would have needed someone to tell her to do it. You know, she was from a different generation and so caring and so loving, but it just, you only know what you know, right?
Yeah.
So I wish they'd given her those tools. I wish I could have known some other kids going through what I was going through. I would have felt less shame, and I could have spoken about it. So whether it be like, I hope these days they have groups or something where they bring children together. I would assume they do, but I wish we'd had that when I was young and that I'd been invited to go. I would have been really embarrassed to go, and then within 10 minutes of being there, I would have been so relieved that I was there.
Yeah.
I also wish my mum struggled in so many ways, having an abusive husband, number one. So even when she was well and not manic, she was still constantly in a crisis point, really, because of the man she was living with. But despite that, she is such a kind and warm woman, and she loved me so deeply, and I never doubted that. And again, I think back then, if a doctor had said to her, or a therapist had said to her, when you're well, have these conversations with your kids, because no one taught her how to handle us better. So any one of those things would have helped.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And it's difficult, right? Because there's lots of other things at play, but I think that's what I was kind of looking for, because in the moments when I've been really unwell, am I the person to bring safety? Probably not, right? Because it's not or in those two instances when I've been very poorly in my life, it's not within my capability to do that because I'm not well. But it's having those plans perhaps in place, which I hope, as diagnoses are getting quicker and awareness is getting wider, I hope that we're able to move into a space where families can have these plans in place of who are the safe people when mum or dad or carer, parental figure is unwell. Who's our go-to person, who's going to be safe person, who's going to guide the ship. And because what I'm hearing is that's what young people need, right? A steady, a constant. And Mya, I'm going to come to you and ask you the same thing, really. So bearing in mind what you just sort of shared before, where you were like, maybe my dad was having one conversation with me and thinking that the filter had kind of stopped at this level, and then mum's having another conversation with me. What would have been a good or a better balance for you in terms of information received? Because it sounded like you were getting a lot, actually.
I was, and I look back with, I'm incredibly gratefully towards my dad, because I think he did such a good job of, like, considering all the things he was dealing with at the time in terms of filtering what I was dealing with, looking after me, helping my sister, helping my mum. But I think at the time, and something I kind of didn't mention, is I really enjoyed these chats with my mum. I would love it where she'd be driving me somewhere and we'd have a really long conversation for an hour. And I would feel like that was me building that bond with her. And I loved sort of getting an insight into my life. And I think looking back, it sort of broke down the mother-daughter relationship. Like, I think people used to joke about us being sort of an ab-fab type relationship, but I was the serious one and she was sort of the crazy one. But it also meant, because we both had massive tempers, that we'd sort of really clash. And I was sort of this very angsty young teen, and she would get just very angry sometimes during manic episodes, and sort of we'd end up having these massive screaming matches, and we'd come away from them and we'd just sort of get on with our lives. And it would probably be my dad, really, who sort of got the brunt of those, really, because he was the one who couldn't cope with that out of the three of us. And I remember probably the worst one was when she was driving me like to Girl Guides, and we had this massive row, and I just sort of went, okay, then let me out the car. And she went, okay, I'll let you out the car. And we did, and we would just clash heads like that all the time. But I think for me, looking back, that was almost part of this sort of pushing the boundaries and seeing how far I could push it. And eventually she did sort of go like, actually, no, that's enough. But I think also that there was almost this sort of grieving process, because for a really long time the language that my dad, because he wasn't a mental health expert, also doctors, because they were trying to make me as a young kid feel better, the language used was always like, we'll figure out the right combination of medication for your mum and then everything will be better. And there was sort of this implication, especially when I was younger, that eventually things will go back to normal and she wouldn't be ill anymore. And sort of coming to that realization as I got older that that just wasn't true, I think was something that was really difficult for me. But I think also the stage after that, as I got even older, was realizing that mum had been ill as long as I'd known her. And actually, for her to not be bipolar would be for her to have been a completely different person, probably from the person that I knew and loved. And so I think that was part of me coming to terms with it as well. Um, but I think in theory, a lot of the right things were done. They tried to stick me. The NHS tried to stick me in sort of CAMS therapy as soon as they found out what was going on and things like that. And as a 10-year-old, I was having none of it. I refused to talk, I think, during the sessions, because I just thought it was silly. I didn't want to talk about my feelings. I wanted to have my parents. And so I think also it is just allowing kids to feel their feelings and come to terms with things at their own speed, while also just supporting them and being there for them, which I think is kind of what being a teenager is like anyway, let alone with the extra factors on top of it.
Thank you. There's parts in there that you're sharing, Maya, that are shared with me on the podcast often by people that live with bipolar. The grieving process of the realization of this isn't something you take something for and get better, and it's like a chapter of the past, something that we just put behind us. Yes, we can come into periods of more stability, but it's that realization of, this is we live with this, right? I talk about it as like the flatmate you never wanted, like when you're the person that lives with bipolar. It's like this person's moved in and they're not going anywhere. You don't really like them. They're not actually that great for your life. They're kind of chaotic. And guess what? I've just got to learn to make friends with this and respect this flatmate, because we have to try and find a way to get along and get through, because they're not going to move out. And that's a really hard pill to swallow. And it comes with a lot of grief. I say that it comes with a lot of grief work. So it's really interesting that you said that, because I've never thought about the ripple effect impacts that has on the people around us of, they're not going to get better from this. They can get healthier and more stable and have more tools and all of these things with the right help and the right support and the right social systems around them and all of these other things. But it's not something we can get better from. It's not, we can't cure it as such, right? And I hadn't really thought about how that, what you've just said, that I had to grieve that, and the complexity of, and this is a question I've asked myself, and I know a lot of people with bipolar do, well, if I didn't have bipolar, would I be who I am? And that's really confusing, like head scrambler for someone that lives with bipolar, because you think, well, is this me? Is this Emma? Is this my personality? Is this bipolar? What is it? What parts of me are real? Is it just like, is this part made up? I don't know. And that's that's like a confusing thing. And I've never really thought about it from your point of view of, well, would I even want it to be, because then elements of my mum would be different, and would that make her not the mum I know? Which is just, you've given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, I think also because like I was writing my book Bird Girl, and a lot of it was essentially talking about this journey of like throughout my teens, like, and my mum and her illness and everything. And I remember on the original draft, my editor left a comment, sort of almost teasingly, but in the epilogue, going like, "And now it all needs to end happily ever after." And I was like, "No, that's not But I think also that would have been a terrible ending because it's just not, that's not how life works either. And I think it wouldn't be the right payoff to it all because actually, I think writing that book made me able to reflect on a lot of things and actually almost content in the way that things will continue to be. And I think it's so easy, especially with the language that is very often used in like medical spaces. It's so easy to feel like it's a curse because it is so difficult. And so like we've spent a lot of time having conversations and trying to focus on some of the positive aspects at least as well that sort of within all of it.
And it's a different experience for everyone, right? But what you've said there about, oh, now we need to have a happy ending. Well, the ending's unwritten, right? Because we don't know. Like, so for me, for example, in my journey with bipolar, it changes depending on my life and how it's changing. So now that I have a living child, it different things will be triggers for me as I go, and it's like new uncharted territory, right? There's still uncharted territory. There's still things that, with as much work as I've done, could be come along and be very unexpected. So it is yet to be written. So there can't be the end, happy end, you know, like it's like it's yet to be. It should be sort of more to be explored, perhaps. I don't know, but and we don't know what that will look like, right? I'm going to ask Kayleigh now. Why did you decide to use your experiences? This is a question that's come in for me to ask you. Why did you decide to use your experiences with supporting a loved one with bipolar to write a TV drama? And what does your mum think about the series?
I decided to do it sort of on a whim, in that I had been writing at the point that I pitched the idea of In My Skin, which I think was 2017. I'd been writing for 5 or 6 years at that point, just inventing TV shows, you know, plucking them out of thin air sort of thing, and not really getting a huge amount of traction. And then I had a particularly sort of, you're constantly being rejected in this industry, but I had a particularly painful rejection on this project that I really, really thought was going to go. And I just thought, well, I need to get another idea rolling to help me move on from this disappointment. What the hell am I going to write about, kind of thing. And I sort of thought, well, there's one story that I've been afraid to touch for a long time. And at the same time, I'd met someone. I do improv comedy, is my sort of, I moonlight as an improvised comedian. And I'd met this amazing improv teacher from America named Holly Laurent, who'd said to me in the whole class, the key to unlocking your creativity is sometimes the thing that you think you need to hide deepest. And it sort of planted this seed in my brain about the thing that I was always hiding. And so kind of on a whim, I just wrote this really honest pitch for a TV series that was literally just like, when I was a teenager, this was my life. Because at that point, I was in my late 20s and I was doing a lot better with it all. And I was honest with my friends by that point, my close friends, about it. But certainly in the industry, I was never honest. I wasn't walking into meetings with producers or being in writers' rooms and being fully transparent, because I guess I still had this idea of like, they're all middle class. I need to pretend like I'm like them. I need to pretend I'm the same as them. My assumption then being bipolar's for poor people. Do you know, when you like peel back the layers, that's obviously in my mind. I'm here with middle class people. They've probably never been touched by mental health issues. So I still wasn't being upfront professionally. I wrote this really honest pitch. I sent it around, and instantly, of all the stories I'd pitched to that point, I felt a difference. It was the first time everybody I emailed with it responded within hours. Go, oh my God, can we meet? When can we talk about this? And I was just like, oh my God, straight away, I've not had this kind of traction before. And then it sort of snowballed from there. And very quickly, all those producers that I thought were middle class and untouched by the issues that I was touched by, like straight away, my granddad, my dad, my auntie, my cousin, everybody, all these stories. And so, yeah, it just quickly compounded. I'm doing the right thing. I need to carry on.
Wow. Isn't it amazing what happens when we share the pieces that we feel need to be buried?
Yeah.
Just, yeah, I'm quite in awe of you, really, for doing what you've done. I think it takes an incredible amount of courage to go to those places and be so open with them. And I believe it brings us something quite special along the way for ourselves sometimes, right? In our own kind of journey of like unlearning, unraveling, and putting it all back together again in a different form.
Yeah.
And your mum, did you talk to your mum about what you were pitching? How did she feel about that? What were the conversations around that for you guys?
Well, this was a sort of like bizarre, you can't ever, what's the word? Life is always stranger than art, or life is stranger than fiction. At the point that I wrote the pitch for In My Skin, my mum was still very much suffering with bipolar. Hers is so severe, she can't work. She hasn't worked in a long time. She's very heavily medicated on antipsychotics and whatnot. So she really lives a sort of, she's sedated. Her life is like, this sounds harsh to say this, it's a half-life. She's kept muted and sedated so that she can't tip over into mania. But that means it turns off all the other things that makes life worth living, quite honestly, which is really just devastating to me. But at the point of writing the pitch, my mum hadn't been manic and had a breakdown in 10 years. So I felt like I could write the TV show at that stage because there'd been enough time for me to reflect on it, and she seemed like she was in an okay enough place. So I wrote the script, sent it off to BBC. At that point thought, I'm not going to tell her about it yet because it probably won't get made like everything else I've ever written. And then I got the phone call to say, the pilot has been greenlit, we're going to make this one episode. And I was like, okay, so now I need to tell my mum. And then the next day I got a phone call from my mum, and she said, hi babe, I've had a breakdown. And she hung up the phone and then went offline, turned her phone off, and then was gone. I couldn't track her down for hours. My sister couldn't find her. The hospital she'd always been sectioned at when I was a teenager had closed down, so I didn't know where to even ring. It took hours, and we eventually located her. She'd been picked up and taken into a different facility in Cardiff. And so that was that. She was sectioned again, and I was like, well, I can't tell her now about the TV show because it's almost too much of a burden. And that year then became the worst year she's ever had mental health wise. She was sectioned 6 times in 1 year. So I battled with that for a long time about whether I was doing the right thing or not. I wound up leaning on my sister, my younger sister, and saying to her, look, in lieu of mum being able to read this, will you read the script and tell me, do you think it's okay? Have I misremembered anything? Or is there anything that's too personal? Or if you just don't want me to do it, just tell me, kind of thing. So my sister read it and she said, I love it. Don't change a thing. You have to tell the story. And then, so my mum, when she eventually came out of hospital, I was able to talk her through it. And it was tricky at first. She sort of said, do you think I wasn't a good mum? And I was interviewed for a piece in The Guardian where they ran a headline that was something like, I was ashamed of my mum. And so she saw that, and I had said the words, but I'd said them in, a wider context. But yes. I'm glad it meant that we had a conversation that we wouldn't have had otherwise, where I sort of got to explain that I was ashamed, but in a way that teenagers just want to fit in. And it didn't change the fact that I loved her more than anyone else, but it was shameful in the way that not having the same trainers as my friends had was shameful. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the pilot came out. She was really proud of the pilot. And then by the time we got to film the first series, she was well enough that I could bring her to set one day and she got to see it all happening. And I think she was at once very proud, but also bored. She was like, this is really boring. Because you just sit around and redo the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, she was excited for about half an hour when people were making their cups of tea. And then she was like, I'm going to go home.
Can we go now?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. But she is very proud.
I'm glad that it's all, you know, come round in that way, and you had the support of your sister, and that your mum, that you're all together on it, you know. Mya, can I ask you what motivated you to write your book, and how your family feel about that book? Could you share about that?
Yeah. So I'd wanted to write a book for a really long time, but I'd conceived it very differently. It had always been a book about birds, which Bird Girl is, but it was only when I'd sort of plotted out all the chapters and the story that I realized it just didn't make any sense as a story without talking about my mum's bipolar and the way that my family reacted to it, and the way that we then used birds and nature to cope with that. And I sort of had this realization that I was going to have to talk about that in the book, and it was terrifying because I started writing this when I was 18, and I don't think I ever even told any of my friends in secondary school about like what I was dealing with, not just because I didn't think they would be able to understand. I didn't feel like I had the language to make them understand. And to go from that to trying to write about it was really, really scary. And I remember I went to my mum and I asked if she would be okay with me writing about it. And at the time, she was more enthusiastic about it than I was. She was like, I think that's a great idea. I think that'll add so much to the book. And like when we had a conversation, she was very into the idea of sort of telling the story warts and all, and telling a very honest story about bipolar. And she talked a bit about the few bits of media that she'd consumed of people that had bipolar that had really stuck with her. And it was literally just the TV show Homeland, which her and dad had watched and been like, oh wow, that's like mum. And like a Cry documentary from like 2000 where they'd watched it and been like, do you have bipolar? And that was it. And so she wanted there to be a piece of media out there that was properly telling that story. And so I sat down and I wrote through my experiences of it all. And then during the editing process, I made me, my older sister, my mum, and my dad literally sit in a room for like 3 days and go through the book, and for everyone to give their opinion of what had actually happened, which there were clashing whatevers. But it was literally, I know that my mum really cared because it was the first book she'd managed to read in about 15 years, I think. And she pushed through and she read it and she was really proud. But I think it was just, even though it was really scary, and I think none of us really come out looking perfect or even particularly good at certain points in the book, which is true to life. Like, I'm so glad I did. And I think someone once said, like, if writing a book's cathartic, you should probably just go to therapy instead. But I am quite glad I wrote the book. And I hope someone else will read it and identify with it in some shape or form as well. I think especially actually because I talk a bit about the experience of dealing with mental illness as someone from an Asian family in particular, where it's incredibly stigmatized. And just this lovely journey of my nanu, my mum's mum, going from literally believing that mental illness is an evil jinn, an evil spirit possessing your body, to when she now sees me, she goes, how's your mum? Is she taking her medication? And the 15 years that she's been through. And it's just, I hope that someone out there will read it and sort of understand that story of bipolar with the same empathy that I've tried to have for my mum as well.
Yeah. And it is about breaking down stigma. You know, what you both have done in getting this out in these different medias will help. It will. It absolutely will. And that brings me nicely onto my next question, really, which is, how do you think the stigma around bipolar or manic depression, as it used to be called, and it was called when I was first in the realms of figuring out I had something wrong, how do you think that kind of affected things then, and how do you think it is now comparatively? I'll ask you first, Kayleigh.
I think it's getting a lot better, with a long way to go still. But certainly telling these stories, I always liken it to when I was 12, my nan, who I adored, my mum's mum, who was my rock and my everything, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I was terrified. Not only the fear of that, I just thought cancer means she's going to die. And so the fear of a child of thinking, oh my God, someone I love is going to die, but also the only person keeping me safe in this mad situation is going to die. And then it just so happened that EastEnders, at the same time as all that, did the storyline where Peggy Mitchell got breast cancer. And she lived. She had chemotherapy and she lived. And I remember watching it and being like, phew, my nan's going to be okay. Oh my God, thank God. And she was okay, thank God. But that was the moment when it locked into my brain what a Trojan horse TV is. We all have one, we all watch one. You don't have to go and like sit down and listen to some boring lecture or read some boring book. You can just kind of, subtly help people imbibe these messages. And so things like In My Skin and other TV shows being made and Bird Girl and all, it absolutely is helping, I think. And just societally, therapy is way more normalized now, right? All my group of friends are in therapy. It's almost a badge of honor, you know? Not far be it from like a shameful. We're almost like, yeah, of course I'm in therapy.
Aren't you? It's a bit like that. It's good though. It's a good thing.
And if you know someone who's not in therapy, you're like, whoa, what are you hiding?
You clearly need to go.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, all these things massively help, but there's still such a long way to go.
Yeah. And Mya, what do you think about the stigma, like when you were younger? Because I heard both of you sort of say that you have been more open with your friends about it now, but you weren't when you were younger. So
Never.
Mya, how was that for you?
I think there were a few different aspects to it. Like, I felt like everyone else had these sort of picture perfect storybook families, and the thought of even beginning to explain that my family wasn't like that was literally incomprehensible to me. And this is sort of the early 2010s. Like, I remember when I started year 7, my secondary school used to have posters like being like, don't call people bipolar, that's not what you mean, and stuff like that, like to do with, like, you know, that was the level that we were working at. And so I don't think I ever even particularly attempted to explain what was going on, versus I think as an adult, and especially these days, like, people just have so much more of an understanding around mental illness. But I think the struggle with bipolar in general, sometimes it feels like something that's particularly difficult to understand, versus I feel like something like depression has a well-worn place within sort of the cultural language now, and especially sort of the more manic aspects of it still feel more difficult to find the language to talk about, at least casually in conversation. But I think things are changing. I would comment though that I think bipolar still feels like something that's much more difficult to get diagnosed with and get help for compared to other illnesses. I anecdotally hear, especially from young women, so many stories about being diagnosed with depression and being put on SSRIs, or being diagnosed with BPD instead of being diagnosed with what clearly is bipolar. And so I think there is such a long way to go, but it feels like we are hopefully heading in the right direction, to do with destigmatization and having these conversations openly.
Yeah. And I want to thank you both for having this conversation with me very openly today. I'm really grateful. And I'd like to close on just a parting thought from each of you. If you could give a pearl of wisdom to a parent, so me, perhaps. Maybe I'm doing this very selfishly, but no, you know, and lots of people watching this live with bipolar, right? And they are parenting. What would be a one piece of advice you could give a parent in terms of parenting, you know, people like you, but we're here with bipolar and we're supposed to be your safe guided ships. What can I do as a parent for my child? And I'd love to hear one thing from each of you. Who'd like
I
to go
would
first?
I would say secrets are toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And when, even if it's well-meaning, when you try to keep things from your children to protect them, they know something's going on and you are subliminally telling them this is shameful, it should be kept a secret, and it should take place in the shadows. And that is the worst thing you can instill in a child. Instead, bring it out into the light, air it out as soon as you are able and ready to do it from a calm place, and a measured place. Put the sunlight on it and say this is something we can talk about freely.
Thank you. And Maya?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think children are able of understanding far more than maybe adults give them credit for. And I think also the practical reality is a parent with bipolar is a parent with bipolar, and there's no magically getting rid of that. And so it's instead helping your child build an understanding of what you're struggling with as well, and allowing them to see you as a human who is dealing with things. And I think in the long term, that's how you build sort of a positive understanding relationship, as well as helping them to understand what you might be struggling with. And so I think just that communication, that trust is just critical.
Thank you. And then I suppose the one thing I might like to say is, because I've given this a lot of thought, is for me personally, I want my daughter to know that yes, I live with this, and it's not your job to look after me. And we have these adults around us that are going to look after mummy and you, and it's not your responsibility. It's my responsibility to let you know what's going on, and it's not your responsibility to kind of take all that as yours, right? We're still going to make sure you're looked after. So for me, because I've had a long time to kind of think about this, I'm 41, before I've had a living child. So I hope this conversation has helped everyone that's watching. Thank you so much, Kayleigh and Maya. I'm so grateful, and it's a deeply personal conversation for you both, I know, and it has been for me too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.